This presentation is being recorded and you are currently in listen-only mode. Now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's meeting over to our presenter, Eric Landez. Eric, you now have the floor.
Hi, thanks, Jenna. And I am starting my sharing session. My name is Eric Landis. I'm with AgileThought. We provide custom software solutions and also do some agile coaching, those kinds of things, ALM consulting, mobile development, that kind of stuff. And that's where I'm coming from. I'm a solution architect there, or technical architect with AgileThought, and that's where I'm coming from. So let's go ahead and get started. As Jana said, the title of this is Stop Gambling with Your Quality, Build Tests into Your Stories. Really, this is to help your team understand the story in collaborative ways and get hooked into development. So for those of you who have started down the Agile path and you're using Scrum or some other Agile methodology, this is really geared towards you, because we're looking at how to even get better as we're using Agile methods. So the agenda, we're really going to do an introduction of Scrum practices. This isn't going to be an overview or anything, but just to give us a level set of what kind of Scrum practices we are. And we're really looking at Scrum. I'm not looking at other Agile methods at this point, but what we're doing here could be used with any other Agile methodology, really, just modified a little bit to, say, go with Kanban or anything else that you're using, XP, that kind of thing. We're going to look at our generally accepted user story practices. So we're going to see what people are doing normally when they're writing user stories. And I'm going to go over a little bit as to why people use user stories. Then we're going to talk about collaborative user story AC sessions a little bit. Then I'll give you a demo on that. And then we'll really get into the meat of acceptance criteria in a user story, and then another demo. And while I will be using Microsoft TFS 2012 as the place to store our user stories and our product backlog, a lot of these techniques can be used really with any tool. This is not a tool-specific webinar. So let's look at our introduction to Scrum. I think a lot of people, when they first talk about Agile or any type of Agile methodology, they kind of look at this Dilbert comic strip. You know, we're going to try something called Agile Programming, the pointy-hair boss says, and that means we're not going to do any planning or documentation. We're just going to start writing code and complaining. And, of course, the one guy says, I'm glad it has a name, and that is our training. And that's what a lot of people do believe Agile programming is, or they used to think that when Agile was younger, and some people probably still think that. And I think what you'll find as you're using Agile, you'll probably say, as I did, you know, I've been doing Agile for probably over 7 years now. Started with XP and have been doing Scrum and Kanban methods in different areas. We'll find that Agile is really a very disciplined approach to software development, but it's different in its disciplines than, say, a waterfall approach. And that's what we'll be kind of comparing as to how user stories can be used, especially when you're coming from a waterfall approach. So why do people really come to Agile methods? So I'll go through real quickly. We understand requirements are rarely fully understood before the project begins. Agile, we're trying to take requirements in small bite-sized chunks, and that's really what this session is about, is getting those bite-sized chunks, the user stories, into a format that is understood by teams and really reduces your risk as you go forward in your product, and especially in the beginning by using things, acceptance criteria, that can be turned into tests to really help that overall requirements become a little bit more solidified, a little more flexible from doing all your requirements up front. What we're trying to do is to get your requirements solidified at the right time, and so we'll talk about that. Users know what they want, so obviously we want to show working software initially, right? So that's really why we're doing Agile, and Agile is saying if we don't see the software first, then we can't really know if it's what the user had requested. So we're trying to get many different versions of the software out there for them to see in small bite-sized chunks, and the users will only know that what they want is what they want when they see the software. I know it when I see it is the acronym there. And then we're welcoming changing requirements. If you're using waterfall, if you've used waterfall, you push the riskiest parts of the development cycle to the end, so we fail late into the cycle rather than failing early and then smoothing it out. So I've been in lots of projects where this holds true. In the very beginning, we're failing. Management is getting really nervous about that. But then as we get close to the end, we've gone through that problem period, and we've reduced that risk at the end of the project, and people understand we can deliver these features or we can push the project date, and they're very comfortable with that. And those, again, are good reasons to move to Agile, and probably reasons you've used for it. And, we want sustainable effort, that modern software projects require heroic efforts. That's what we're talking about. We want to have a sustainable effort so that we don't have our programmers quit on us, because, let's face it, right now developers, it's hard to find developers, and we want to keep them when we have good developers. And we have things about documented failure rates. One thing I would mention, and keep in mind, software development is not really like manufacturing. I guess that's one of the key reasons for a move to a more agile mindset. It's more of a product development effort, which is definitely a different way of doing things than, say, a manufacturing operations project would work. So this is another reason to go to the agile way of doing things. Just so that we're on the same page, just want to, again, review the Agile Manifesto. I think if you've done any kind of agile training, you've seen this. We say individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. The really important thing about this is that the Agile Manifesto didn't say that the individuals and interactions is the most important thing. It's saying that we value the things on the left more than the things on the right. So if, for instance, a tool doesn't work the way the team thinks a tool should work, or it's hindering their interactive progress, you should probably replace the tool, we would think, in Agile, rather than looking for teams to adapt to a tool. So it's those kinds of things to think about, and that's what Agile Manifesto is about, and what kind of sparked this revolution within software development. So here's some principles. I'm going to quickly go through these because there's really only 3 or 4 that we care about for this presentation. One of the things I'll point out there in the middle, welcome changing requirements. So that's a little different than maybe you're used to, even if you've been doing Scrum or Agile for a little bit, is, yes, late in the game, in the middle of a release, we're going to think that requirements are going to change, and we're going to welcome that because we understand that we've learned a lot, and now we're changing the requirements. And usually those requirements, they're in the form of a user story. So we're hoping that the tools we give you are going to help you think through those user stories and have these changing requirements, but also help you think them through and maybe get to those changing requirements quicker, because you're going to have to change. Developers and business people working together is another point over here, and absolutely, we really want a lot of collaboration on user stories and acceptance criteria. And Excuse me, had to take a little sip of water there. And of course, working software is the primary measure of progress. I think that's really kind of very important for all types of things that you're doing within an Agile project. So again, I'm coming from a Scrum background is where I'm going with this particular talk. And the Scrum roles are product owner, team, Scrum master. This is, regular Scrum, as Scrum is taught by Scrum.org and the Scrum Alliance. So keep in mind that you may have some differences here, but the idea is always the same. We have a product owner, we have a team, and a Scrum master. Those are the three roles, the main roles that you have to be doing Scrum. And as we look through there, there's different things that we're doing. The product owner owns a product backlog, so that's just user stories, and they're really responsible for making sure the team helps that they prioritize the product backlog and that the user stories make sense to the team and that they're representing the interests of all the other stakeholders through that product backlog. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on. Now the team certainly has interaction with that product backlog. They don't own it, but they certainly got to have a lot of input, telling product owner things like, if we do this story first, then that'll make this story, I've seen this happen in teams, then this story will be a lot quicker. We can get that done quicker because there's some dependencies on here. Again, that may not be true, what we might think of as pure Agile, but it's things that do happen when you talk about user stories. There are dependencies. In here we say teams cross-functional, no titles, collective ownership, and then we have Scrum Master. So again, we're not doing a Scrum talk, but just want to give you that level set of where I'm coming from when I talk about Scrum. Is the Scrum process. The really important stuff for us right here is how long is your sprint going to take. I generally recommend 1 to 2 weeks. Don't like them to be longer than that if we can avoid that. And again, the product owner is looking at these list of user stories usually. It might be bugs in there as well, and that's their product backlog. And then if you look over here at the sprint backlog, that is where we are actually putting the user stories and committing to them as a team, and there's probably a lot more detail in there. That's where that acceptance criteria is going to be, we're going to think is pretty well, I don't want to say finalized because we can always change it, but it's going to be pretty fleshed out in your sprint backlog. There's other things in here, but that's more about the Scrum process. So let's look at a typical product backlog, and we'll show you that in TFS. So I've got this this demo project on the TFS online website, visualstudio.com, and it's called Bowling Kata Demo. So if we go here and view our backlog, we're going to see some user stories. So I'm writing a game that's going to score our bowling game, and so that's the software I'm creating. And if we look here, we've got a backlog and got some nice features. This shows us how many sprints we're going to get this done. If we're completing this with a velocity of 10, we've got our effort, etc. So the product backlog, these are all user stories right now, or product backlog items in TFS speak for the Scrum template. And these product backlog items, the PBIs, that's where we're going to have, and we'll get to it, acceptance criteria. So if I open up the product backlog item, we'll see there's an acceptance criteria tab, which we'll be looking at later. And we'll see that particular story 5, we have prioritized higher than a story later down here, like story 3 or 4, which are in sprint 3. Or I should say in sprint 2, because as we add stories, we're going to get to sprint 3. Excuse me. So this is the product backlog, and we mentioned the sprint backlog. So in the sprint backlog, we're going to be doing some of that acceptance criteria. We're going to be looking at the user story, but we're going to be adding tasks, etc. too. And again, that's not the purview of this, but this is where we estimate. So at this point, I would expect there's some acceptance criteria here, as we can see. The team is talking to the product backlog, the product owner in the sprint. So, and we'll talk about this, 2 ways you can do this, but hopefully the team has discussed some of these stories before we get into the sprint planning meeting, and they have a good idea of what is required, and they will ask questions in the sprint planning meeting based on the story, the user story, and the acceptance criteria here. When we go back to the backlog, and we just look at the backlog, all that really needs to happen is the team needs to be able to estimate. So we see that effort, and we see that some of these don't have estimates. So that means the team didn't feel comfortable estimating, or maybe they didn't have time. So the one thing you need to keep in mind is, and I'm looking at the same story, let's look at a different one. If we look at this story, there's no acceptance criteria and no description. So the team probably needs a little more detail before they're going to estimate this. So when you're in the product backlog stage, you may need to do some acceptance criteria. You may not. It's really team dependent. If you can, I always would think it's a good idea to put some kind of acceptance criteria in there, even if it's high level. And that gives a team some time to do their estimation. Now, what will normally happen either in the sprint planning session, we'll do some estimation of new stories. Some time will be set aside, or I've been in teams where we actually set aside a different time with different team members to actually estimate. You normally want the whole team there to do the estimation, and if you can do it in half hour or whatever, that probably makes sense. So these are the places where we might refine our user stories to be something a little better than what I've got here. So let's look at how we can, now we've seen the product backlog, how can we make that maybe look a little better and be a little bit better for team members to actually make some estimates. Because let's face it, the real reason we're doing these user stories is not to complete them, but to get something done that customers will use. So the reason we're doing user stories in this small amount is to get this out to the product owner. They can see the working software, and then they can come back to you, and they've got that feedback, and that's where the changes come in place as they realize, especially early on, they're going to realize that maybe this isn't the kind of software that I had thought. It's not behaving the way I thought it would, or customers have gotten back to me and said, wow, that's not exactly what I was looking for. So this is why we create the user stories in a small enough manner that developers can get it done quickly. And like I said, I like the 1 to 2 week sprint time frame. But we want to get user stories done quickly so we can deploy them so that we can see what's going on. And let's face it, as we keep developing and get better at development, companies are releasing software quicker, which is a good thing. So now we want our user stories to be done right. So if you're coming from a big requirements background where you've had BAs that create these big documents with requirements, user stories are a little difficult to do really, and to get right initially. Eventually you will. I mean, it's just like anything else, but it's a different beast because we're doing things in a much smaller manner, and we want things complete in these small cycles. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is we want something that can be complete in a very small amount of time. that gives some value to the end user. And that's where the user stories are. This is where I think acceptance criteria really helps you to define what's small, what's not, and if it's adding value. So here's how I normally approach user stories. The first thing is to think about, why are we doing user stories? We're doing them as a promise for a future conversation. So if we look at that backlog and you saw some of those really small, those user stories that didn't have a lot of detail, they really were a promise for the conversation. And because we have these tools like TFS, we can actually capture some of that conversation to help remind us when we're done with the conversation that this is what we agreed upon, and this is what the product owner meant by this story, and give some concrete examples. So especially in that product backlog, that's really, we're not going to use that as a hammer when the product owner says we want something different, right? It's not a complete specification, and it's not a contract. And team, it's not intended to be interpreted without the product owner. So that's where that collaboration comes in. I highly recommend things like, we've done things in the past like test creation sessions where the product owner, the tester, and the developer get together. They agree on the tests that will be run. If you have this acceptance criteria set up correctly, and you do some sessions like that, it's going to be real easy for you to create tests that will tell the developer when this user story is complete. So that's why we need that product owner in there, so they can tell you, hey, this is going to be complete. Because obviously, if you look at a story and you interpret it and you write it without talking to the product owner, when you go and demo that story, the completed story, to the product owner, you could have a very bad situation where the product owner says, that's not what I meant. And I hate to get to a demo and the product owner tells you that's not what I meant. When I do demos, especially the end of the Scrum demos, we don't want any surprises. So have lots of interaction with that product owner. So you're probably used to the story template. A user story usually follows this kind of role, this kind of format or cadence. As a user or role, I want some business functionality so that I get some value. So, for example, let's say we're doing a coupons type of site, a website. Here could be an example story for that. As a consumer, I want to be able to find coupons by my current location so that I can find the best deal closest to me. And very simple example. You could do something similar for like, an airline site or something like that. But that gives you an idea of, we have the role as a consumer, we have the business functionality, finding coupons by my current location, and I can find the best deal closest to me. As you see, the story actually leaves a lot to interpretation, and that's where we need to talk as a team. Now we get into the idea of acceptance criteria, and how do we want to do acceptance criteria? And there's a lot of ways you can do this, but the product owner, the acceptance criteria is usually product owner expectations on what's going to be delivered. So we certainly want to put in the acceptance criteria things like, if the position of a button is important, we want to somehow signal that. So acceptance criteria might include wireframes or even graphics of how that screen should look. And it should be clear if those wireframes or graphics are exactly as it's supposed to be, or just to give you the feel of what it's supposed to look like. But then I need, as a product owner, I need to see it, and then we may do some work. So that's perfectly valid. If the team agrees with that, you can certainly say in our acceptance criteria, here's roughly what we want it to look like, but we have to see it on the screen and see how it looks in Chrome and IE and all those before we finalize it. Again, if the whole team agrees with that, I think that's perfectly valid to do those kinds of things. If they don't, then you have to, if the team doesn't agree to that, then I think we all have to stand back and come up with a different solution. So maybe you do have to have a designer do the wireframes exactly as you want them, and the product owner sign off. I prefer a little flexibility myself. The other things that product owners' expectations could be is business rules and validations, or non-functional expectations. Now, for business rules and validations, another form that you can use is a cadence similar to what we have with the user story, but that cadence is used in behavior-driven development. So it's actually kind of a test cadence. So this is where we get into building the tests into your user stories. So in your acceptance criteria, you could actually write an English language version of a test, if you will, that could be automated. So the cadence is given a scenario. So if you look here down at the bottom, given a scenario, when I do something, then this result happens. And the tools that can be used depending on what programming language you're in, I think like RSpec is one of them in the Ruby world. Is it JSpec in Java, and then SpecFlow in the .NET world. These are all behavior-driven development testing frameworks, and if you write your acceptance criteria as kind of tests like this, you can actually copy and paste them into a unit test that can be used for automated testing. So that's kind of a cool feature. But beyond that, the acceptance testing will really get your team thinking about the acceptance criteria. It will get them thinking about what they have to do to implement the story. So let's look at how we might do that in one of these stories. So if we look here, we actually have some acceptance criteria in one of these stories. So the story allow the score to increment by a spare. What does that mean? Well, the actual user story is, as a scorer, I want to use the spare logic to increment the score if the previous frame was a spare, so that I have an accurate score. If you're familiar with bowling, that might make sense to you. I don't know if I wrote that very well, but if you're not familiar with bowling, that probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So we really have to talk it over. So to make that a little more clear, if you look here, I did my first scenario. Scenario 1, given I just rolled a 2 and 8 in frame 3, and my score was 29 at the end of frame 3. When I bowl a 5 in the first roll for frame 4, then my score up to frame 4 roll 1 should be 39. First scenario, very nice. I think it really helps the team see some concrete numbers so that they really understand what do you mean by a spare. But a lot of times I like to do at least 2 scenarios. And let's make that 2 instead of 12. And just to make sure people understand that it's not a fluke when they pass that first scenario. So scenario 2, let's say we roll a doesn't matter here, 3 and 7, in frame 10. No, that's not good. If you're a bowler, you know. Let's say 9. All right. So and this should go on. You should be talking when you're developing these. You should be talking with testers, with developers. And let's say this person's really a bad bowler, but they finally got better. So their score was 20 at the end of frame 8. Okay, when I bowl let's say I bowled a strike all of a sudden, frame 10, then my score should be 40, I believe, right? So we give a couple different scenarios, and if you have some negative scenarios, I'd throw that in there as well. So that is one way of doing that, using this acceptance criteria. Now, you certainly could do some other things. You know, we wouldn't have to use the given when scenario. And I like the cadence of that, and I like the fact that it kind of forces us all to write our AC in a certain way. That really helps teams as they're looking at their acceptance criteria to be expecting it to be in a certain format. It's really up to the team if it works. I mean, it may not work for you, right? So for story 2, we're going to say, for story 1, we're going to say, as a user, I want to as a user, as a bowler, let's say this, as a scorer, I want to calculate each roll into my score to get a total. So I can get a total, let's say. So I can have a total. So there we go. We have, I don't know if that's a good story, but it's a start anyways. And then our acceptance criteria. So let's say you don't really want to use that method I gave you. You certainly could use a different way of doing the acceptance criteria. So we could write in here if we roll 1, 2, then 3, our score should be 6. Right, so that's your AC, right? And as long as everybody understands that, you can certainly write it this way. The only problem I have and that I see with this is as you get more complex into more complex scenarios with your stories, then that's an issue. But what I would say is if you do get into these complex scenarios, so let's say we got in here into a complex scenario, let's say, and then I said, if I roll 1, then 8, then 10, then 5, my score should be, so in real bowling, what would this be? Let's see, then 5, then 4. So our score would be 1, 8, 9, 19, 29, so like 38, I think, is right, hopefully. For those of you real bowlers out there, hopefully I've got that score right. But as you can see, what I'm doing here is all of a sudden I'm throwing in a strike into this story. This story is all about calculating each roll into my score so I can have a total. So if I'm a developer and I see this AC that says it should be 38, and I have no knowledge of bowling, I'm going to be questioning why would my score be 38? I really think it should be, 28, right? I mean, you're adding 10 there. I think you made an error in addition. So that's wrong, and I think I have the math wrong, but hopefully you get my drift here. The whole thing is that this AC is bringing out some real differences that we maybe didn't get in the initial conversation about the score. Hopefully you did, but if we capture it here in acceptance criteria, now I'm going to say, we're going to change that, and that's going to be story 7. And story 7 is going to be the story on how we score strikes, just like we have a story on scoring spares. And this is the power, in my opinion, of really detailing acceptance criteria. So again, lots of ways you can do this. I'm using this tool, TFS, which is a fantastic tool. I really like it. But there's all kinds of other tools out there that you could use to track your backlog. It's really whatever the team wants to use. I've used Pivotal Tracker, used some others, Rally. There's definitely others out there. Version 1. They're all out there. Use what works best for your team. Being a .NET shop, if you already have TFS, the 2012 stuff's pretty good. So unless you have good reasons, I'm not sure why you'd use another tool. But, if you're not, for whatever reason, you may prefer the other tools. Excuse me. So as we get back here to the AC, current slide. This is, as I said, that's really a good way to understand, to help your team understand by placing your acceptance criteria in a place where they can see that, where they can specify that. And where I have had a lot of really good help with that is a lot of times on some of our teams before a actual sprint planning, a subset of a team would go over user stories along with the product owner for an hour, the stories that are upcoming in the sprint and maybe a couple more that we think we might get to. Go over them. Team would ask any questions, clarify what is meant by those different user stories, and give the product owner some questions about their acceptance criteria and allow them to really hone the acceptance criteria. So when we got into planning, there were a lot less surprises. Now, there's certainly going to be changes even within the sprint to those stories, but we were able to get through sprint planning a lot easier. The stories got done a lot quicker because the team was very familiar with those stories. They had acceptance criteria in the stories. They didn't have to go back and dot every I and cross every T with the product owner. They only needed to clarify when they didn't understand, because they already had that discussion multiple times with the product owner on what the story was, so what the story meant. And you can get a team into a really good groove by having those kinds of what I want to call ceremonies that are outside of normal Scrum or other processes, but that kind of adapt to the way your team works. Another way to think about that is maybe if you have business analysts, maybe have the testers and business analysts pair to do the acceptance criteria for stories, so that the tester is ready to come up with a test when the sprint comes up, and they understand the story, and they can even explain it to the developers. Or you might even think about maybe the BA and tester role can be combined. I've seen that happen, and it makes a lot of sense in some cases. To go with those sample scenarios that we talked about before, I really would urge you to put that in a format that is very consistent with the way other teams or the way the team is really expecting that, and maybe in a way a tester could possibly automate. So let's just show this. Hopefully I can do this. You could maybe do a test scenario. So maybe we have a test plan. Let's look at our test plan. We're going to do a new. Can I do this from here? Oh, they're in preview. So I may not be able to show this to you, but if you have any kind of automated testing solution, or heck, just use this. Let's just use our backlog here. You know, normally if you go through testing, you can have your tester sit down for the scoring implement, and if they didn't want to use the scenario one, etc., you could actually write in kind of a pseudo test steps, you know, from home page, select bowling. Since I'm doing bowling, that's kind of strange, but we're going to select the bowling application, and from the bowling application, enter these scores, blah, 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 blah. Current total, or whatever you call this, should equal blah, right? Should equal a number, whatever that number is. So you could write that on your as a test if you did not want to do the scenarios. You could use the manual tests. The tester could start writing a manual test when going over AC, and kind of do that before the sprint starts. Again, these are all things, suggestions that may or may not work for you, but they're really something to just think about. Don't necessarily use them, but they're good ways to enable that collaboration between members of the teams and the product owners groups, so that they can create what I want to say testable user stories that are pretty much testable even by developers before they pass them on to the testers themselves. So the other benefit you get out of giving these scenarios is that a developer is going to have to run their whatever test they have. So hopefully your developers are doing unit tests. Well, they're going to have to write unit tests based on the acceptance criteria, and if you do that in a way that is conducive to them writing those different scenarios, they really are going to pass fairly tested code back to the testers before they even get it. And that's really what we're going for. So that helps you in your craft and getting that software delivered faster and with high quality. So that's really what we're aiming for. So finally, this is my bio. That's really all I have at this point for the testing. As I said, I really think this is a great way to do your user stories, to do your backlog. One thing I do want to float out there for you. This is something we do, especially when you start a project, because user stories, when you start out a project, a lot of times it's really hard to get a good backlog going. So what we've found that is very effective, and this is where you can use these techniques of writing good user stories along with good acceptance criteria, is to do something, we call it like a visioning phase or sprint or something like that. You know, it's 3 days to a week of, maybe longer depending on your software, of creating a backlog. And so the whole team is together. We're writing user stories along with the product owner. We're writing wireframes, and we're estimating those stories. And by the time you get done with that visioning phase, you have a great backlog that it allows you to get a good idea of your release plan. And it's not perfect, it's going to change. Keep in mind, everything change, it's going to change as we get things out into the wild and we see how these user stories interact. And as your audience sees what the software actually does, they're going to have some different ideas that you may want to incorporate. Great thing about using a Scrum framework or any Agile framework is we can get those changes in before we do the actual release. But we found that visioning plans tend to help, or visioning phases tend to help, especially large projects, get off to a great start and get software out and being delivered pretty frequently quicker than if we don't have that phase and we're kind of struggling to get the user stories out there. That visioning phase really gives you an idea of what you're aiming for during that release, the whole team, and has that added benefit of having a decent backlog so we can start work almost immediately once that phase is over. So that's all I have, Jana. Let's see if
Great.
I can.
Thank you, Eric.
And I'll put my contact info in the chat in the IM window.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and request control so that you'll soon see the first of 3 quick poll questions in the slide area. And I'll scroll through them for a few minutes after the meeting to give you a chance to answer. Your feedback is valuable to us, so please take a moment to answer the poll questions prior to logging out. And as a reminder, you may request a copy of the slides directly from our presenter today in the IM window or make a request to him via his email address at AgileThought. And Eric, maybe you could put your email address in the IM window?
Okay, yeah, I did, but it really looks pretty crappy. Sorry.
Did it? I didn't show up on my end. And I'd like to thank Microsoft partner AgileThought and speaker Eric Landez for their presentation today. AgileThought presents Stop Gambling with Your Quality, Build Tests into Your Stories. There we go. Now it's up. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's online meeting. Thank you for joining us. And once you finish the poll, you may now disconnect. Thanks, Eric.
Oh, thanks a lot, Jen.
Sure.